Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us at Walk by Places for Plenary Panel 1, Does Planning Care About Black Lives? I'd like to thank our wonderful presenters today for joining us, who will tell you a bit more about themselves in just a moment. But we would like to welcome first our moderator, Robin Abad Okobillo, Senior Planner at San Francisco Planning Department, Commissioner Mitchell Silver at New York City Parks Department, Oboyi Reed, at CEO Equiticity and co-founder of Slow Roll Chicago, and Dr. Destiny Thomas, founder and chief executive officer of Thrivance Group. So I'd like to go ahead and now pass it over to you, Robin, to take over.
Thank you, Juliet, and thank you, Project for Public Spaces, for organizing this gathering and organizing this conversation today. The situation in our country and our society at this moment, with the overdue, you might say, outrage at in particular police violence against Black lives, and a larger burgeoning consciousness and certainly discourse around racism in all our institutions, is a really important thing for us to be addressing, and specifically hearing from Black leaders in our field who are working to dismantle that racism and bring us closer to equity and justice. So I'm honored to be here amongst such distinguished panelists at this plenary, which is, Does Planning Care About Black Lives? And so, as Juliet mentioned, we'll be hearing from Dr. Destiny Thomas, Commissioner Silver, and Oboyi Reed. And I think maybe let's start, panelists, by addressing the title of today's plenary, which is, Does Planning Care About Black Lives? So many of us in the profession are painfully aware of how our institution is a racist one. And it's contributed to the inequity that we see in our cities, socially, spatially, and otherwise. And so I invite you to, from your perspectives and your understandings as professionals and academics in the field, open us up and give us some context for how planning is and has been a racist institution. Perhaps Commissioner Silver, I'll prompt you as the former president of the American Planners Association and the incoming president of the American Institute of Certified Planners.
Well, thank you, Robin. Let me first open up by saying there's no question that we look at planning. Planning is related to the built environment, planning for growth and change, basically being doctors of cities, making sure everything runs well. Does planning have a racist history? Clearly by congressional acts. The intent of zoning was to really protect property for the gentries, those landowners, because the first zoning ordinances were basically restrictive declarations that basically told you who could not live there, and Jews and Blacks certainly were on that list. And so over time, when landowners were very concerned about what was being built next to their property, zoning evolved. There was enabling legislation at the federal level that trickled down to the state. And it was how to design cities, how to build settlements, and Blacks were never really looked at favorably in that light. Always segregated on the other side of the tracks, never got the full advantage of investment from cities' capital funds. So if you look at the history of planning, it did not favor people of color, and it did not favor Black in particular. Then we had the New Deal, and you looked at exactly what happened to cities, urban renewal, how funds were given to the suburban areas. So if you look back at the history of planning for places, which planning plays a large role, it did not have a very good past. Now, having said that, there are certainly a lot of planners that are willing and open to change, but we have to look back on the impact of having single family zoning, of having a capital budget that favored certain taxpayers and not all people that lived in the city. There's a lot of work to do. So I'm very delighted we're starting this conversation. Black Lives Matter has changed the entire national conversation to focus on planning, on design, on landscape architecture, and deal with some of those racist elements, whether intended or not intended, so that we can provide a better path going forward. We plan cities for all. And that includes all people. And so I hope as we start to have these conversations, the planning profession and other allied professions will come to terms on how some of those racist policies have hurt people to this very day. We don't have these under-resourced communities by accident. It was intentional in many cases, and now it's an opportunity to make sure we lift all communities because everyone should have an opportunity to prosper and live in a decent, safe neighborhood.
Can I add
Dr.
a couple of
Thomas?
points? Yeah, I'd like to add
Yes,
a couple
please.
of points to that because I think um, our origin story as a field is incredibly important, right? And when we talk about how our systems and places came to be the way they are, especially as Black people experience them, the origin story is important, right? That slavery, definitely, and Jim Crow and redlining are key points in time. But I think it's also important for us to understand that um, the legacy of racism throughout the various fields that make up planning is not just situated in the past. And I think it's easy for us, especially those among us who are well-meaning, to temporarily situate racism as something we used to do. And so there's questions that come up around whether or not we should be discussing it or putting resources toward resolving that today. And I would just add that when we look at our data practices, the blind spots, the racial blind spots that show up in data collection and analysis that lead to technology that literally doesn't acknowledge Black people in many cases. When we think about spatial design and also process design, because our data supports this legacy of racism in the way that it does, what we have in the built environment becomes a direct reflection of that origin story. And then I would also say that the people who are sort of have this legacy of access to processes and to policy making are still there. And they're still the decision makers and the implementers. And that is also having an impact on whether or not Black people are visible within the scope of the various projects that we do. And so I say that to say, going back to the title of the workshop, does planning care about Black lives? It's an important assumption for me to make that whether we have accepted the humanity and decency and dignity of Black people in our hearts as a field is less important to me as it is to literally change the systems that have been upholding racism. So I don't know if planners care, but I think it's time that our system evolves.
Robin, thank you. Thank you for the question. As most know who are watching, it's the central question of this plenary. For the planning community, it's the central question of the day. Does planning care about Black lives? And my response, no. It did not in its origin story, and it does not today. Thank y'all for coming out. Good night, peace. Oh, y'all still here? Y'all, okay, well, since y'all here, let's ride. Let's take Chicago, for example. The origin of Chicago is a city that was, excuse the background noise, a city that was predominantly white in around the 1910s, in the early 1900s, during the Great Migration, when hundreds of thousands of Black folks came to this city. We experienced restrictive covenants, which limited where we could live to a very tight geography. We experienced de facto segregation. We experienced all types of discrimination. When the highways were built in this city, somebody look at a map, you are going to see the highways carving around predominantly Black neighborhoods and continuing to enforce segregation in predominantly white neighborhoods. The way we live in Chicago today is a result of the planning sector, the planning community, the profession of planning being overtly racist. It's time we recognize that. And even today, we could call out what Planninng is doing that is racist. Even today, we're able to call out the Planning's reliance on enforcement to improve traffic safety. Even in Chicago, even after the video of Laquan McDonald was murdered, even after the US DOJ did a comprehensive investigation of the Chicago Police Department and found rampant racism, rampant corruption, rampant abuse, the city of Chicago, pushed forward by the Chicago Department of Transportation, created a Vision Zero Chicago plan that prioritized enforcement as the leading strategy. Even today, after the heightened awareness around Black Lives Matter, anti-Blackness, structural racism, we still have planning departments in Chicago and across the country who are unwilling to state that enforcement should not be a part of Vision Zero and other safe streets frameworks. The answer, does Planninng care about Black lives, is an emphatic no.
Thank you, Oboye. Dr. Thomas referenced how the Planninng institution, it's comprised of certain structures and practices, and of those, only some communities really have access and are able to, quote, sort of engage, right? And other communities, in particular, the Black, Indigenous, and people of color demographics of this country, have traditionally been disenfranchised in large part from that. And so I'm curious if the panel could talk a little bit about what, quote, community engagement is now. What's your diagnosis of how it's conducted now? What kind of outcomes does it render? And sort of leading on to maybe a question after that as well, how can it be reconceived or thought of if we are to address the institutionalized racism within our profession?
I know Dr. Thomas has a lot to say on this topic, so let me start. When I hear that term engagement, just like any relationship, I take that term very seriously. When you're in a relationship, you're moving toward engagement, it's getting to know someone, it's forming a relationship. And when you go to public meetings, you can't just have a town hall. That method, that model works for some communities, but I think for others, you have to develop a relationship with the community. And when you're a planner, you're going in there, the communities very quickly, they can read you, whether you're being sincere or you're just doing checklist planning. Having public engagement has to be real, has to be authentic. You have to go out to the community and form a relationship. There's no way I can just drop in without spending time to get to know the community, get to know the stories, get to know their history, and truly understand how to plan for that community. That to me is first and foremost. And far too often I see planners doing checklist planning, paint by numbers, when it has to be more real and more authentic. I shared an experience when we were on our pre-call that I remember there was a white planner went to a community and there were older African-American women that lived in public housing. And they were angry and they were being confrontational about a planner once again coming in with another vision about what to do in this community. When I told that person, I said, it's not just a confrontation. What you're hearing is 30 years of pain, of being lied to again and again, plan after plan with no implementation, and now you're back again for another plan. I think if you're gonna go into a community, I wanna see some cash up front. It's very different to say, what do you wish for your community to be, versus I have $10 million to help bring this community forward. Let's talk together about your needs, your aspirations, about what you need for this community to be lifted up, and then be real about it. If you're going to a community with no way of doing any implementation, then tell folks I'm about to engage you for a year with no money, with no ability to implement, to see what kind of response that you're going to get. Authentic communication has to be real. You got to foster a relationship. You have to be honest and not play any kind of games. And I don't often see, if the room is a diverse community and is underrepresented by Black people, that people are going to go out there to make sure all voices are heard. You don't just plan for who shows up. If that community is diverse, you have to do the homework to go out, to hear those voices, to hear those stories, and understand their vision, their aspiration, and their pain about what happened in this community. To me, that's authentic public engagement, and I don't see a lot of it, whether it's planning, whether it's landscape architecture or architecture, that's what we need to get to.
Mhm. Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, I would. I think that when people hear the word engagement, especially people who are overly reliant on other interventions like enforcement, they are fearful that their desired outcome is on the chopping block. Either that or the timeline or budget for the project that they want to do is at risk. And the easy answer to that is that it is true. For engagement to be authentic and genuine, you have to go into the door, walk into that door willing to leave with an alternative or a project that's different from what you thought it would be. To that end, I would agree that having a transactional process by which you engage folks is probably the worst way to go about it, and also the most expensive way to do engagement. And so, for example, what we do at the Thrivance Group and what I've always done in various roles as a planner regarding engagement is that I believe in what would be considered a community planning model. That is that the people who ultimately have the power and access to decision making regarding land use and infrastructure investments are the people who live in or represent the community by virtue of the community saying that that's who their representative is. In addition to that, the specialists that are attached to the project, that being the engineers, the policymakers, the elected officials, and the technical planners, need to participate in something we call a social climate analysis, which is a process by which planners don't just go out and do a field check to see what existing infrastructure is in the space. Rather, they go out and assess using an interdisciplinary or social science approach to planning for that space. So if you were to go out to an intersection and see an excessive amount or even one person who is unhoused, then you know that you need to have housing advocates involved in your land use planning process. That's just one example of some of the outcomes that have derived from a social climate analysis. I would also add to it that going back to the first question, another thing that we lift up during our community engagement processes, which doesn't even have to be connected to a project as an outcome, is restorative justice or transformative justice sessions. And these are spaces or healing circles that we create for residents and community members to engage, not just with our field and the project that we want to implement, but the people who they view as having an eroded sense of trust or just not belonging in that space to begin with because of the history and legacy of racism and other types of harm that have occurred. And we found that by facilitating these types of spaces in confidential settings, we don't report back to our clients who participated and what the outcomes were unless that's a part of the healing plan. By doing that, we're able to actually get more meaningful discourse and a more long-term understanding of how existing residents view that space evolving with them in it. So we not only see this type of genuine, ongoing, non-project associated engagement as engagement, we also see it as an anti-displacement measure. And we also see it as something that preserves and also builds resources at the community level for long-term and long-range planning to happen.
I'll be
Thank you,
brief.
Dr. Thomas. Yes.
I'll be brief because I'm confident that Commissioner Silver and Dr. Thomas are some of the foremost experts in this country around how to do equitable community engagement correctly and properly. What I'll add briefly here is that largely community engagement as a strategy serves to make embedded planners comfortable. They execute community engagement in a way that is comfortable for them. And given the egregious racialized inequities within planning, the egregious racialized inequities that's experienced by Black and brown people, should planners only do what makes them comfortable? You're not doing your job. You are not doing your job when you go out into our neighborhoods and you're comfortable. The proper way to do community engagement is to face fears, to go into rooms you're uncomfortable going into, to listen to people you're uncomfortable challenging you. It requires you to do much more homework than you've ever done before to engage our neighborhoods in a way that is respectful, in a way that is equitable, in a way that's just. So,
Obayi, can I talk to you about this for a second? Because I think,
sure.
you know, folks who know me know that the word comfort is something that I regularly associate with planning, the intentions of particularly white planners. And if we're really being honest, what's also a part of like the planning sector's origin story is this desire to center the comfort of white people. So not only are white planners looking to engage and interact in a way that reifies their comfort and easeability of work, but it's also, like plainly stated, their intention is to make other white people comfortable through their work. That is how the suburbs came about. That's why our president is on his Twitter right now talking about restoring the comfort of white suburbia, because now with this disease rampant and with uprisings happening, especially in what we call inner cities, white people need a sense of hope. White people of that ideology would need a sense of hope to attach themselves to. And the first thing that is not lost on me, that the first thing that came to our president's mind as a solution is to restore their hope and access to their own land and relegated space away from us. And so I say that, all of that to say that culturally, right, there are those among us who culturally have struggle and discourse and rigorous community and nation building as a part of our cultural traditions, right? It's why we play the dozens, why our elders were playing the dozens. It's why at the lunch table in high school, we were roasting each other, you know?
That's right.
Because we are not afraid of confronting the things and issues that make us uncomfortable. Meme culture in society and on social media derived from Black people taking a very disturbing and traumatic lived experience and turning that into joy and things that you can laugh at, and but also that is a type of archival research that will live with us for generations. And so I think that when we ask, I'm looking at the comments, and when we're seeing questions about how does this look and what do you mean? It's about looking to the traditions and practices of the cultures and people that you're looking to engage through your work, and giving them the space and allowing people the uninhibited space to engage in ways that match those traditions. And so this is why we look for joy-centered opportunities to engage and interact with each other. This is why we want to sit down with you and have a one-on-one conversation about the legacy of racism, not because we have an appreciation for exhausting conflict and combativeness, but because this is how traditionally we've come to grow and learn and persist despite and in spite of racism. So these are practices we should be carrying forward.
I'll just add, I completely agree with every single syllable that you uttered. I would add, I encourage everybody who's listening to study this framework that was crafted by Dr. Thomas. Forgive me in case I get the title wrong. It's Dignity Infused Engagement Process, I believe is the title. That's the correct way to do this work. I encourage everybody to study it. In addition, I encourage everybody to take a look at our Equiticity Racial Equity Statement of Principle. There's a principle on there that talks about local innovation that gets at this idea of engaging in our neighborhoods in a way that is fair and just and equitable.
And I'm seeing a comment, not to call anyone out, oh, from Commissioner Silva, so perfect, a planner of any color can engage successfully. And I think that perhaps that is possible, but I do also believe firmly in the power of representation and lived experience as a valid qualifying aspect of your presence in the work and in the field. As somebody who has had to verify my own degree 5 times for one job, and as somebody who doesn't have AICP acronyms on the end of my name, despite having been a planner since 2008, it's really important for me to have my colleagues to know that there are other things that qualify people in ways that they do not qualify to do this work, and to save money doing it, because we don't have a learning curve when it comes to knowing ourselves.
I think that's a great segue into another topic of conversation I know we all wanted to explore, which is how we can actually set about to having established, the framework and the background of why our institution looks the way it does today, why our profession, our practice, the demographics of those who practice planning are very non-representative. How do we start to dismantle structural racism in the planning sector? I mean, some ideas have come up already so far. Representation certainly is key. Who planning departments and government agencies are hiring, who they're cultivating and elevating into leadership positions. The San Francisco Planning Department, for example, along these lines, our commission, rather, the San Francisco Planning Commission, adopted a resolution earlier this year, an equity resolution that commits us to looking at all of our internal hiring practices, the way that budget and staff resources are allocated, who's elevated into leadership, are, internally, very much focusing on how we as a department can start to reformulate not only the complexion of our staff, but where we put our money, but also how we do things externally. What are community, quote, community engagement practices? Who are we engaging with? How are we reaching them? It's an incredible opportunity for us as a department, as a larger city, to intentionally begin that and address that work. And so I'm curious from the panel, from your various perspectives, what are the ways in which we, as agencies, as individuals, as professions, as professionals and allied kind of practices, begin to dismantle structural racism in the planning sector?
Wow, that is a big question. Let me start first, because you had mentioned representation, and exactly as we become more diverse by 2040, minority majority, and I do hope that term changes by 2040. But if you look across all of the professions, planning, engineering, landscape architecture, all those professions are struggling by having more people of color in their profession. All are trying different ways. You look at the schools, when people get exposed to these professions. So there's a lot of work to be done just about exposing people to the profession. Having said that, when I talk to young people of color and they hear the term planning, oh, you're responsible for gentrification. Oh, you're responsible for demolishing that building and building something new. Very often it does have kind of a negative connotation, so you understand the potential what planning can do about revitalizing and healing communities for the better. But that typically takes more and more people of color getting out there, affirming exactly the work that is being done by everyone right now on this panel. So there is a lot of work to do. In terms of addressing structural racism, we have to start speaking out. There are a lot of people saying planning, racist, are you kidding me? I don't see it. So there's a lot of discovery and explanation that's going to have to occur. At the American Planning Association, we're now taking a big look inward, led by some of the Black leaders within the organization, to have a conversation about what were some of those things in the past, so we can start to share with people exactly how this profession has been destructive over the 100 years it's been in existence, so we can start to pinpoint and address go beyond the equity, diversity, inclusion, and start going deeper into racism and what policies, laws, and practices that led to redlining, that led to disenfranchised communities, that led to the inequity in how we distribute our capital dollars. That's going to take some time, but in terms of representing, we have to put those faces, those voices of planners and design professions that are people of color to show the battles they've experienced to try to improve places. So hopefully there's a question about what we're doing here in New York City about our parks equity, communities that have been neglected for 2 decades. Now having a black commissioner, head of this agency, I'm laser focused on addressing that equity because it comes from my heart and my soul. Not a checklist, not a campaign promise, but something that I'm committed to doing. And we need more people like on this panel committed to that cause. So it's kind of a 2-pronged effort. We need more people of color speaking, mentoring, showing what we can do as leaders of color. And then we have to call out specifically those policies, those laws, those practices that really have been destructive for well over a century.
And the anthropologist in me wants to go ahead and call a thing. So I will add that really a resolution, yes, seems really long term unless we are talking about abolishing it as a structure entirely. And so reparations is really the only real point of juncture for beginning to atone and resolve the harms that have happened in the past and that are currently still happening. I recently published an op-ed in Streets blog that details, I want to say 12 actions that cities or municipal agencies or planning departments can take themselves without the support of the federal government or without having to get a ton of political will. They could do these things today, and we could begin to start the healing process today. The Thrivance Group is actually working on something called a CPRU, which is the Comprehensive Package for Reparations Through Urbanism, which will be rolling out more formally in 2021 with the regional coalition. But I'm saying all this to say that until we are ready to start calling a thing, and to start putting our dollars and our intentions behind the assertions that we're making today around feeling sorry and sending prayers for Black people, then this doesn't get any better. You could do a cursory search of the execution of Breonna Taylor and find that her local planning department and developers in that area are complicit in her death and murder. So there's some gruesome details that never make it to the planning school or onto these webinars that I would encourage folks to just do a little bit of digging. And then once you get done reading and pontificating, really start to change laws and policies so that we can start our healing process.
I agree with everything that was said. I'll tell you about what we see as a process to get to dismantling structural racism in the planning sector and any other sector. As mentioned, one is to formally acknowledge the racist system that underpins this profession and to acknowledge past harms. Atone for those harms, address the egregious harms that have been inflicted on Black communities in this society. Adopt and operationalize these frameworks which exist for you all to use. I talked about the dignity-infused community engagement process. I talked about the equiticity, racial equity statement of principle. There's the untokening principles of mobility justice. There's the Black Space Manifesto. There's the principles of environmental justice. These are frameworks which exist that are Googleable. You can find these easily, adopt them, operationalize them. Whenever we're talking about racial equity or justice frameworks, it's important that one of the things that we do in the beginning is an analysis to understand the severity of the problem, an analysis to fully understand the inequities that are being experienced by racialized groups. And then we create a community-informed process to come up with the solutions together. The ownership of these processes and these plans rest in neighborhoods. They do not rest in planning departments and DOTs and mayor's offices. The ownership rests in neighborhoods, because the people who are the best equipped to determine how do we remove inequities from our society are the people who are inflicted with these inequities. The best strategies to instill equity come from people who are experience inequities. And then we talk about, we do not leave the work of dismantling structural racism, the work of removing inequities. We do not leave that work to well-meaning people. We legislate that work. We policy that work. And we create models around how that work is executed. There should be mathematical formulas which direct resources to meet the needs of people who need those resources the most. And then lastly, we talk about how important it is to have models of accountability. We need to understand in real time, is the project, is the program meeting the needs that were laid out at the beginning? Is it achieving the outcomes that we had identified at the beginning? And in the event it's not, there needs to be a mechanism of power for people at the neighborhood level to go in and adjust the program, adjust the project to ensure that it's doing what we intended it to do. That's our process around dismantling structural racism and planning and any other sector.
I don't want the conversation to end without lifting up two other important details which are associated with the anti-racist practice of our field, and that is that our field is also continuing to be very abrasive and harmful toward people with disabilities. Black people in particular tend to die at the hands of policing mobility because of their mental and emotional disabilities. And that's something that needs to be addressed, as well as misogynoir in the multiple layers of our planning culture and our mobility culture. And so not shaming people about their mode choice without having a deep analysis of why they had to choose it, or what types of danger they face absent that mode choice, as well as not criminalizing people because they're experiencing poverty, addiction, or PTSD that was caused by the decisions that we made through this field.
Absolutely, and Dr. Thomas, I think that's where the social climate analysis tool or approach that you brought up is so critical and important, and really should be, a foundational, part of our approach to addressing community planning. We can't divorce the physical, spatial, built environment from all of the social realities that communities are facing, and so. That the work that Untokening does, I think, is also very powerful and germane in terms of us rethinking how we approach mobility and transportation for all communities, especially those who were physically disconnected and otherwise disenfranchised from physically being able to get around, not to mention economic mobility. So some of the ideas that have come up just in response to this last question, the frameworks that were cited, Black Space, the work that Untokening is doing, the work that both you, Oboyi, and Obayi, pardon me, Mr. Reed, and Dr. Thomas, those are all really, I guess, approaches to evolving and sort of reformulating the institution of planning and the practice. And there's this maybe more subversive and radical idea about abolishing it entirely, right? Are the structural weaknesses and inequities so deep and pervasive and innate, part of the DNA of this institution, that it warrants thinking about something else entirely? And so there's a touch of this in the article that Dr. Thomas wrote about reparations, which I think in a way is still like making up for the ways that planning has failed. But it sort of points us to, is there something else? entirely. And maybe we could just close our discussion today with exploring that idea a little bit.
Well, maybe because I'm a planner's planner, the idea of just kind of blowing it up and starting over is something look, I want to hear all voices. I'm open to any ideas. But as we all know, there's two parts of planning. There's kind of the regulation side of the zoning, of the density, and just how you plan our cities respond to growth and change. That's one aspect. Every state, every city has legislation to manage cities to approve it. The planning side is more the policy side. That's the part right now that I think we can do far better. And I think that, to me, requires a lot more reform because when I approach equity, it's about fairness. I wanted to share with you what we're doing in New York City. Came on board, 2,000 parks. Turned out there were about 10% that had seen no investment in over 2 decades. There was no surprise these were in places of color. So our parks equity was like, if equity means fairness, then we have to put those parks first. It was unfair that those communities who were paying their taxes through rent or directly through their real estate taxes did not share in the prosperity that every other park in the city received. And these are places, parks, where people connect, where they get healthy, where they come together, where they break bread. And not to have a quality space where these communities have come together was simply not fair, and it just turned my stomach. And so now we're reforming well over 60 of those parks that have not seen investment in 20 years as a way to rectify it. That is a planning approach, and to me, understanding that there are inequities and that Planninng now taken an explicit and direct response to fix those, rather than doing this planning study, is to me where Planninng has to really change its direction going forward. Yes, the legislative side, the law side, looking at single family zoning and how that has been discriminatory is one aspect, but the policy side is where we have to start rethinking our approach going forward because it's blatantly unfair. Having inferior schools, buying a house to go to the better school. We can go all the way down the list. There was one question about how do we teach our white colleagues who are also white planners about racism. I kind of get tired of explaining again and again why there's racism in the system, but that's something we have to do. We can go down the line across the board because these communities were not disenfranchised, underinvested by accident. Those were years and generations of intentional disinvestment or lack of funds to see those communities get lifted up. That's the part of Planninng I think that we have to address. And we have to take a look also at the laws and regulations that also limits people mobility and actually keep them suppressed and segregated in communities across this country.
I might just interject before I know that Obai and Dr. Thomas want to respond to this too, that yes, we do have a role as, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color in this profession to speak and to, you know, to share our common lived experiences with, you know, our non-BIPOC colleagues. But at the same time, it's not our responsibility or duty to teach everyone. I mean, everyone has their own work to do. I'm really encouraged by a lot of my colleagues who, you know, are white identified for doing the work. That's really important. You know, we as BIPOC people, I can't be responsible for changing the institution by ourselves. Those who have traditionally held that power and that privilege have their role, a huge role in reformulating and restructuring. So, and I do happen to feel that my colleagues take that on, at least in my experience as a planner. The folks take that very seriously and earnestly and really want to learn and understand how they show up as individuals in the profession and in communities. But I'll step back. So abolition, Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, so the only alternative to abolition is erasure, and we've been living that reality. Obai and I have been ostracized from the field at times. And I am, you know, although I think it's beautiful that the DICE strategy is still on LADOT's website, I don't work there, and I'm not sure that there's capacity within that organization to facilitate the framework in a way that would match the spirit in which it was created, because the community helped create it. So to that end, I think that things like reform and maybe a sprinkling of some moratoriums on development are steps in the direction of abolition. And I think that those of us who are uncomfortable with the term abolish will get closer to that end of the spectrum once they start to at least make room for some of these alternatives to actually be implemented. I think it is safe to say that this is a great moment to imagine the what ifs that we hadn't imagined before. And I think nothing about abolishing police or abolishing planning scares me in the context that we're living in today, where we now have to talk about abolishing rent because no one's got the money to pay it. And so we will continue, especially with climate change, to inch toward this mark where we won't even be able to have discussions like this about what should we do, because our communities will be decimated and in such great disrepair due to our long-term neglect of the land and the people living on it. And so I would encourage folks to embrace concepts that are abolitionist, especially if they're accompanied with actionable next steps. Because if we continue to do the work in the ways that we are doing it now, we won't have a space or a place to plan anyway.
I'm not a planner. I didn't study planning in school. I'm an econ major, an aspiring economist. We practice something called the community power matrix, where everybody has a role in working towards the freedom we seek. I am not of the opinion that institutions which harm us have a right to exist. I'll say it again. I am not of the opinion that institutions which harm us have a right to exist. I will follow the lead of Commissioner Silver and Dr. Thomas as planners, as people who are entrenched in this field. They know, should it be abolished or reformed? What I can tell you is that I know enough about the institution of policing to know that it should be abolished without question. And should people who understand planning and that sector and that profession tell me it should be abolished, you enjoy my full support.
And, you know, I'm very excited about the conversations that are happening. I don't know where it's going to end up. I hear both of you loud and clear, and there's no question there needs to be some very hard conversations. There are certain practices that must stop and need to change. And so I don't know if the two of you are disenfranchised, not on my, at least not on my watch. We need all the voices to really amplify exactly why planning and those agents involved in planning are viewed the way they are viewed. Now, having said that, and this is something where I want my colleagues to respond to, I'm a planner, and sometimes people gave me a lot more power than I got credit for, because I had tons of ideas, but I had a legislator, I had a mayor, even though I was pushing the envelope, like saying, you cannot do that. I'm very grateful now, as a commissioner, I have a mayor that allows me to push the envelope when it comes to equity. But I always look back, like for example, Urban Renewal and Robert Moses, these people were not planners and did a lot of destruction. So I always want to make sure we understand who were the perceived planners and then perceived planning when we were given acts and legislation we had to implement. But I know there were a lot of plans that were pushing, saying this is wrong. So I do want to make sure we kind of put that in its place. But certainly change is needed. I believe reform is needed. I'm interested to hear about the abolishing, what it gets replaced with. But when I got into profession, I was determined to make communities better for people, specifically for Black people, because I grew up in Brooklyn. I saw what was around me. And so I chose this profession because I saw the possibility of actually enhancing places for people. But I'm open. I think we have to hear all the voices. And I'm very pleased, whether it's APA or ASLA or AIA, whatever organization it is, whether it's placemakers, urbanists, that now is the time to have these very real conversations. And the first time in my life, this is the first time it's happened. So I'm excited, keep our foot on the gas pedal until we see some real change.
Well, panelists, we're just at about time, and I wanted to thank each of you for your thoughts and for, you know, for setting the framework for all the discussions and going to have this conference on us this fall. And I think inspiring, provocative words as well. I'm humbled to have been your moderator, and I just want to thank you on behalf of the profession and on the behalf of Project for Public Spaces for kicking us off this week.
Thank you for having us. I want to do a very shameless plug that we are a new firm. We are called the Thrivance Group. You can find us at thrivancegroup.com. And I see a lot of people asking about how they can get in touch with the dignity framework that I spoke about. We actually are, because we just hired 8 planners, we are having to undergo what we call the Dignity Institute. And so you have an opportunity to obtain the same level of training that our own staff go through in order to be a part of our organization. We've only got 275 spaces, but I encourage you to log on to our website beginning tomorrow to RSVP.
Well, I think with that, we'll close. Oh, yes. Obayi, please.
I'll just say thank you. Thank you. It was an honor to be on the on this panel with Commissioner Silver and Dr. Thomas and yourself, Robin, as the moderator. I'll just leave folks with this. The root cause of all injustice experienced by Black, brown, and indigenous people in our society is structural racism. Our oppression was and is by design. The most important work we must do is building a society where Black, brown, and indigenous people thrive and where we intentionally dismantle structural racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Obayi. And thank you, Commissioner Silver, Dr. Thomas.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you, Commissioner Silver.
Obayi.
Have a good one.
Thank you. All right, Robin.
Bye.